Okay. Okay, sure. Okay. Same thing with this. Let me just check battery power. Okay. There we go.
Hi. Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started because we have such a short time period today. So, hello. Thanks for coming. My name is Zhenya O'Gara, and I'm representing Viva, which is the Academic Library Consortium in Virginia. I'm here with my colleagues Matt Wilmot from the California Digital Library and Jason Price from SCELC. And we all represent three very different types of consortia. And today we're going to talk about some ways that we are evaluating the impact of open access publishing investments at our different institutions. And I'm going to try to figure out how to do the slides correctly. Maybe it'll work. It's not working. We did try this in advance. Ah, okay. Thank you, Matt. I think it's fair to say for a long time, academic libraries have had reasonably well-defined metrics for measuring our collections impacts. When we subscribe to journals or databases, we track downloads, cost per use, citations, turnaways. We have frameworks like Counter for standardization. We can provide information that's clear and comparable. But libraries and the consortia that support them are increasingly shifting investments away from simply paying for access to content and into supporting the publication of open access research by our communities. These agreements are taking many forms. We have subscribe to open, read and publish deals, direct support for Diamond OA journals, just to name a couple. However, we're not as clear yet on what the measurable outcomes of these investments are. How do we demonstrate the value and impact? What do we measure? How do we know if an agreement is working? How do we compare one model to another? And what's the meaningful metric for different stakeholder groups, from state funding agencies to institutional administrators to faculty and librarian staff? The challenge is that impact in OA publishing support is more complex than subscription impact. We're not just measuring kind of the consumption or the use of the content anymore. We're measuring the creation, the dissemination, the cost avoidance. Some of us are trying for equity, advancement of values like public access for publicly funded research. And with all this, we also still would like to measure the use of the content. So the central question we're looking at today is, what are some of the measurable outcomes of entering into an agreement with a publisher to make an institution's publications openly available? More specifically, what are we measuring? Who are we measuring for? Why does the context matter? And the answer depends fundamentally, we think, on who is asking and why. I want to take just a minute to talk about the difference in our three organizations, and then I'll pass it down for some kind of concrete examples of ways we're attempting to get at this. First, I'm going to talk about SCELC, which is not me. So if I get anything wrong, I apologize to Terry and to Jason. But SCELC is a multi-state opt-in consortium serving over 100 members and 200 affiliates. Their membership is predominantly small and medium-sized institutions, so they do have some research intensive institutions, but not all. And every deal is optional. So when a library director is deciding whether to opt in, they need to see direct value for their institution. So SCELC needs granular per institution data. Will this benefit our authors and readers? Can we justify this to our administration? CDL, Matt, on the other hand, represents 10 research libraries within the University of California system. Because they are a unified system of research-intensive institutions, CDL can take kind of a more strategic portfolio-level approach. This means for CDL, they are also interested in measuring transformative progress. So what percentage of UC research output is now OA? How are they shifting spending from the read access to publish support? What's their trajectory towards a full OA? And then, of course, we are also different, because why would we all function in the same way? So Viva, my institution, we represent 70 academic libraries across Virginia, both research-intensive universities and smaller institutions. We're funded 40% by the Virginia General Assembly and 60% through member cost shares. Because of the state funding, all public institutions must participate in Viva deals. So we have research universities and publishing extensively, and community colleges, smaller comprehensives, primarily consuming or using the research. So we need to demonstrate distributed value across this kind of entire spectrum. This matters because the value we're measuring itself is not standard across institution or consortium type. SCELC might need to look at impact measures by agreement category, while CDL might need to see how much the publisher has made the transition to open. At Viva, we need to see publication across our institution types. Each consortium is looking for standardized approaches to measuring the value of these deals, but we're also all operating from like really different decision-making contexts. So a metric essential for SCELC's model might be less relevant for UC's approach. Okay, I'm gonna drink some water. Here we go.
Yeah. Okay. So I think a critical and maybe sometimes underappreciated aspect of evaluating metrics for publishing agreements, or really for any agreement, is that the data and analysis needed to convey the appropriate information tends to differ significantly by audience. And I'll admit, I fall into this trap not infrequently, right? I complete an analysis, and then I just can that presentation and show it to every stakeholder group, right? But in reality, different groups are gonna have different priorities. Understanding these priorities is critical for making sure that the true impact of these agreements is understood. So I mentioned on the slide here a few of the different types of stakeholders that Zhenya, Jason, and I have identified for the impact analyses that we conduct. In general, there's often a stakeholder group that's primarily concerned with the transformative nature of these agreements. So in UC's case, this is a working group that has fairly direct oversight of our negotiation strategy. They'll want to see how the agreements are performing and how well they are transitioning the literature to open access. There are often collections budget officer groups who are going to be more particularly interested in questions of price and cost avoidance. At UC, this is a committee of associate university librarian level administrators who are certainly generally advocates for open access, but in particular also bring a keen eye to the practical financial questions around these agreements. Our Council of University Librarians is particularly interested to explore questions about how much risk the libraries take on when they enter these agreements, looking to understand things like worst case scenarios, financial protections, things like that. And they're also always thinking about the bigger picture of the services that the entire library offers, not just these types of agreements, but how these agreements fit in. We all also have budgetary oversight groups that are often less engaged in the transformative nature of these agreements, but are particularly keen to understand the concrete return on investment for the resources that they or their organizations are contributing. So depending on the consortium, this might be state or government funders, presidents and provosts of universities, or institutional budget officers. And then, of course, a key stakeholder that we engage as much as we're able are the faculty and researchers who benefit from these agreements. They're always interested to see the benefits that they receive from open publication under an agreement, as well as some of the other negotiation points that we build into these wide-ranging conversations with publishers, including things like author rights, AI license language, other timely topics.
Metrics and measurements also differ by agreement type. For APC-based read and publish agreements, currently the focus at SCELC, it's relatively easy to count the number of OA articles published, the OA uptake as a proportion of the eligible articles that were made open, and the open publishing or APC cost avoidance. The highlighted metrics I'll feature in upcoming slides, but moving into that sort of more aspirational metrics shown in italics, we could get a lot closer to impact per se if we examine the citation rates of open versus closed articles and or global downloads of these articles. As for reading closed articles, there's controlled, otherwise known as paywalled article usage, and the emerging usage by trailing year of publication, which provides a better sense of the effect of recent gains in OA proportion on the controlled article usage. As for our open article reading by our users, we could measure that, but since it only captures some of that usage, since some happens outside the IP range and it isn't an exclusive benefit, we haven't. Well, there are many varieties of beans to count on the read and publish side. The beans are much more elusive on the subscribe to open and Diamond Journal side. And in some cases, they aren't even really our beans. So, right? So, I lost myself with my own joke. All of the metrics on this side, you'll notice, are in italics. They're aspirational, or at least we aspire to measure them more effectively. So in the top right box, sort of the focus of some of this, looking at open articles published overall and locally, if there are any, global OA article downloads of the articles we publish, those might help measure it. But again, that's an if there are any. Then we get into more qualitative measures like support of journals that our communities publish, or support for bibliodiversity in general, those publishers and products that don't fit into an APC read-based or APC-based model, or how strongly, how widely our members are supporting these investments. Those are trickier to count and measure. As far as reading closed articles goes on this side, it's not really applicable because there aren't any unless you perhaps count closed back files that dwindle in importance over time. So reading of open articles has the same challenges here as it does on the read and publish side. So in general, for subscribe to open and Diamond journals, the challenges of showing return on investment limit their scalability to some extent. But now, turning to applications, and each one of us will be sharing some that we can measure. I'll examine. Oops, sorry. Thank you. I'll examine different aspects of the agreement impact using the same published. We will all use the different aspects of agreement impact using the same publisher as an example. So all three of our examples come from one publisher. We are who shall remain anonymous. My value-focused example will use the Skelk agreement data. So the first assesses publish value, second slide assesses read value, and then in the third, read and publish value are combined. So the Skelk agreement began in 2021, and so note that each timeline here shows 5 years of data. The first year is from before the agreement, and the next 4 are during the agreement. For us, the number of participating institutions with these publishers more than doubled in 2022 from 13 to 27. And the x-axis is going to be the same in each of these figures. So focusing the left graph, the number of open articles shown in orange tripled in 2021, the first year of the agreement. It rose in 2022 with the new joining institutions, but then continued to rise in 2023 as the publisher improved their author-facing systems. In 2024, the number of open articles Skelk authors published in this publisher's hybrid journals, shown here in blue, declined significantly, while the number of articles published in fully open journals, shown in yellow, more than doubled, presumably reflecting the many journals that this publisher converted from hybrid to fully open access during that time. Throughout the 4-year history of the agreement, the number of closed articles shown there in gray, the only line really going down consistently, is decreasing every year. And so this really shows that open article publishing is actually replacing closed article publishing for Schelk institutions for this publisher. Moving to the graph on the right, the dotted orange line shows OA uptake, which rose from about 6 out of 10 articles in 2021 up to 9 out of 10 articles in 2023 and 2024. APC avoidance is shown in the bottom solid line in green, and it increased every year, growing the publishing return on investment in the hashed purple line right near it from 23% in the first year of the agreement up to 44% in the last year. So the value of publishing in 2024 under this agreement was $339,800, or 44% of our total agreement spend. But this is only the publishing part of the story. It ignores the read value of the agreement. So on the reading side, the total controlled article usage, shown on the left in the solid green line, more than doubled coming out of the pandemic in 2021, presumably due to the return of the paywall and greater usage from within the IP range, since that had to come from there to get access to those articles. It increased again with the new joiners in 2022, and then showed a slight decline, 7 to 9% in 2023 and 24. But we're also beginning to look at controlled usage of the articles published in the previous year only, shown on the left in the hashed blue line. So for instance, in 2022, those 10,040 requests are the number of times an article published in 2021 was requested in 2022. And the 2023 value of 5,143 requests is the number of times that an article published in 2022 was requested in 2023. This trailing year of publication controlled usage is a much better indicator of the impact of accelerating amounts of open access content being published in recent years, because it focuses on the value of the content we purchased in that year. Looking ahead at the read value timeline on the right, looking at the read value timeline on the right and focusing on the most recent 3 years, we can see that while the solid line increases from about 10 or 20% from 2022 to 2024, the hashed line showing the cost per trailing year of publication use more than doubles in 2023. So this is the pattern we would expect due to double-digit year-over-year increases in the proportion of total open content in those years. Again, though, this is only one half of the story, because it ignores the publishing value of the agreement. So now, if we kind of remember the shape, and I'll flip back and forth between from the graph on the right, we can compare it to the next slide, which takes both reading and publishing into account. Staying focused on that right graph, which has the same axes, a subtle but important change in that solid line, cost per controlled use, is that rather than increasing by 10 or 20% in recent years, it is stabilizing and rather than having cost per use increase. So that green line, the last 3 going up to there, it's flattening, and that's because we're separating out the read costs, and I'll say how we do that in just a second. So the hashed line is the cost per trailing use year of publication. Use is still increasing, although it does increase much less dramatically than when we only look at the overall value, or the read value of the overall cost of the agreement. So our approach to doing that and its impact is shown here on the left. APC avoidance in orange at the top is subtracted from the total spend, leaving a smaller read cost in gray at the bottom, and therefore a lower cost per use. Looking at the read and publish together in this way provides a more complete picture of agreement value. Now I'll pass it on to Matt and Jenya, who will take us a little more from value into impact.
So I talked a little earlier about some of the various audiences for these impact analyses, and I'm going to spend a little time now looking at the different analyses that are of interest to some of these groups, particularly at UC, for this example publisher. I think it's worth noting at the start here that we have agreements at UC that operate on what we call the multi-payer model. That involves incorporating a contribution towards the article fee from the author when the author has research funds available to do so. But critically, if the author tells us they don't have funds available for this purpose, no problem, they're covered within the agreement. So price is not a barrier here. This is really a strategy to help us stretch our support to as many authors that really need it as possible. But that's all sort of background for what you'll see, because the model is not the critical thing for this presentation. The impact analysis is. So I'm not going to go any deeper into that model here, right? So I'm going to start with one of the general analyses that we would discuss with our primary strategic oversight group, which is around our investment per article with this publisher. We don't necessarily have a target for this, and we don't use it as a lever for negotiation with publishers, but it is a general metric that helps us see an overall comparison of value that we get from an agreement, and how we're shifting the publisher's model to support open publication for our agreement. It also helps us understand where shifts in our own investment might be necessary so that we can think more holistically about our investment in open access across publishers. There are a couple of versions of this metric, right? Are we talking about library investment per article, or are we talking about all UC investment, including those author contributions? And then are we talking about investment only per open access article, which gets at the current value, or are we talking investment per any article, including those where the author may have opted out of open access, which gets more at the potential value of an agreement with this publisher? So what I'm showing here is some benchmarking on the left against a series of our largest publisher agreements for calendar year 2024 for both the investment per open access article, which is in blue, and the investment per any article, which is in orange. And in this way, we can kind of see how the investment per open access article gets connected with the uptake of the open access model. Well, investment per any article, the orange, gives a better long-term view of what we might be able to expect from one of these agreements. And we can even start to quantify the gap between the potential value and the current value by observing that for publisher A, for example. And I don't know how readable those percentages are up on the screen for you, but the spend per open access article is more than 50% higher than the spend per any article. So that's a gap between the current value and the potential value that we would look to decrease as we increase uptake in the open access model. So this publisher we're talking about on the right here is just about in line with these benchmark agreements in terms of the long-term potential, so the orange bar. Well, it's actually showing some better current value because our uptake in this agreement is higher than with these other publishers. So as I mentioned earlier, when talking with our AULs for collections, overall costs have a prominent space in the conversation. And what we find is impactful to share, especially in times of austerity where we're being put to some difficult decisions about our collections, is some measure of cost avoidance within these agreements. And so what we see here on the left is a longitudinal analysis for this publisher over the last 7 years, going back to our last pure subscription agreement, that shows our actual spend each year in the solid lines as compared to a hypothetical cost in dotted lines that represents our best estimate of costs in a hypothetical world where we didn't enter into these types of agreements, but rather maintained our subscriptions and let authors continue paying APCs in the wild as well. So recall that our agreements include some amount of author payments through the multi-payer model. So what we can compare on this chart is both the library-only payments, and that's what's in red, so the lower pairing of lines there, and also the total UC payment, including all author contributions under the multi-payer model in blue, or the higher pairing of lines there. And what we can see here is that while our cost has increased during our time under an open access publishing agreement, that increase has been less than the trajectory that we were on prior to 2019. And then on the right, we can benchmark this against other comparably sized publishers. This set represents, I would say, the second of sort of 3 tiers of publisher size based on total agreement value. And our publisher is the third one from the left, so the highlighted one here. And we can see that it's not alone in some cost avoidance compared to other publishers in the category, although not every agreement shows that same outcome, right? It's maybe notable that, and I should say this the y-axis here is percentage as compared to the hypothetical value, right? So it's not that these all cost exactly the same, it's that we're starting from the same spot and showing how it's higher or lower than this hypothetical world, right? I think maybe also notable while we're looking at this is that some of these also represent a pretty significant shift in cost distribution as well as cost avoidance, right? And that's partially been made possible by this cost avoidance. So the next one over, the fourth one, represents a full open access publisher. So that was completely funded by author paid APCs previously. If we hadn't entered into an agreement, it would still be that. But now that we have an agreement that enacts the multi-payer model, we now have a cost share of those publishing fees between authors and the library. And so that's why we go from a blue bar to a shared blue and red bar. And then we get to some of the analysis that we'd share with our library administration. In our case, our Council of University Librarians. These charts are an anonymized display. Oh, sorry, I didn't hit that button. Okay. These charts are an anonymized display of the outcome of a system-wide risk analysis that we conducted in response to the challenges that library and research funding are facing this year. And so one of the implications of the multi-payer model is that it creates some variability within our agreements. So we don't know ahead of time how often our authors will be able to contribute from their grant funds. So the actual cost share between the library and the research funders isn't finalized until the end of the year after all the publishing has happened. And then additionally, the total cost of our agreements is often at least partially dependent on variables like publishing volume, although the actual degree of variance is generally subject to a set of cost controls that are intended to protect both the library and the publisher from significant fluctuations in cost year over year. And then, of course, our current national conditions are likely to contribute to some fluctuation in these input variables. So that's why we felt compelled to do this analysis in the first place, right? And so what's represented here is a couple versions of a 2025 worst case scenario as compared to our initially projected outcome for 2025 based on historic data. On the left, we look at the cost increase that the library could face for each of our agreements in the absolute worst case scenario, which is usually a drastic increase in publishing and a drastic decrease in grant contributions from authors under the multi-payer model. They're sorted here in decreasing order by percentage for that particular publisher, and then the bubble size represents the total cost increase. So we might have a large publisher with a small percentage increase that still could represent a significant absolute cost increase, or a smaller publisher that might have a higher percentage increase, like the second and third ones down, but a much smaller total cost, right? And so we can see that the publisher that we're looking at, which is publisher G on this chart, is kind of in the middle of the pack with a potential 7% increase. And then on the right, we have the same chart, but looking at a more expected worst case scenario. So that represents more of what we think will happen in the current environment. We think that less funding for research means that fewer authors are able to contribute under the multi-payer model. So that could increase library costs. But it's also likely to result in fewer articles overall, which could exert some downward pressure on costs within these agreements where there is some variability based on publishing volume overall. So in fact, in this scenario, we even see a handful of publishers where our costs could decrease due to those shifting publishing patterns. And here, our publisher ranks a little bit closer to the top of the risk table. And so that starts to tell a little bit of a picture for this publisher, right? Taking these charts together, it shows that the real financial risk for UC, for this publisher, in this agreement is predicated on author contributions under the multi-payer model. So publishing volume fluctuations have little impact on the overall cost of the agreement, but the library's cost could fluctuate based on that the participation in the multi-payer model. So from here, I'll turn it back over to Zhenya.
That last charts, which I'm sure make total sense. So again, using the same unnamed publisher that Scalc and CDL used, let me show you just one more alternative view on measurable impact that's really important to my group. As a reminder, Viva serves both really large research universities, like over 30,000 FTE, and really small academic institutions with less than 1,000 FTE. And so for all Viva deals, all of our public institutions are always included, from our small community colleges to our large research universities. So they can't be left out of a publishing deal, even if they aren't likely to have a large publishing population. If you look at the chart on the left, the blue bars show the percentage of institutions publishing within each of our school types, so like doctoral, public comprehensive, and private. And so for this agreement, I can see that all 8 of our, unsurprisingly, public doctoral universities have published, so 100% participation from our research-intensive institutions. But we're also seeing engagement from smaller institutions that would have never had access to these publishing supports on their own. And so for us, this is a really important indicator of value. 2 of our 7 public 4-year institutions without a research designation have published, and 4 of the 5 smaller private institutions that opted into this agreement are actively publishing. When these smaller institutions engage, they're showing strong output relative to their actual size. And then the bubble chart on the right is another view that kind of reinforces the same idea. Each bubble represents an institution, x-axis showing the average FTE and the y-axis shows average articles per publishing institution. And then the bubble size reflects the participation rate. So again, our doctoral institutions publish at high volumes, but those smaller bubbles are really punching above their weight when you normalize it by size. At the more macro level for this agreement, we've seen 259 articles published across the consortium, representing approximately $832,000 in APC cost avoidance for Virginia institutions. More importantly, perhaps, is the example of one of our public 4 years, which has about 4,400 students and has published 6 articles, avoiding over $20,000 in APC costs. So that's not an institution with a research budget or dedicated publishing funds, but because they're included in Viva's agreement, their faculty have access to the same publishing supports as the faculty at our large institutions. So this is really important to us in how we fulfill our mission and to our state funders. We have to show that Viva's model creates equitable access to publishing support across our entire Virginia higher education system. But oh, thank you. This is really hard to remember. There's a lot going on up here. Within all of this, we're also facing what the 3 of us have been kind of informally calling the measurement paradox. So the OA models, easiest to measure for local impact, may actually be in some ways the least sustainable and equitable, while alternative models can be really, really difficult to quantify for local needs using kind of the existing frameworks and data that we're all collecting. So for example, with APC-based read and publish, transformative agreements, these are great from a measurement standpoint. We can show cost avoidance, cost per article, clear institutional benefits, but cuts to research funding, which we're all experiencing right now, are undermining institutions' ability to participate in these consortial deals. And there's real concern about how APC models limit the ability of researchers without sufficient funding or institutional support to publish their work. There's also concern that many of these agreements are not truly transforming as fast as the expectation was that they would transform. No pressure. And conversely, the library community really values Diamond OA and subscribe to open models. And within Viva, we actually have a mandate from our community to diversify our OA models across the spectrum. These models have multidimensional global value that's also incredibly hard to capture at the local level. Subscribe to Open as an example. We need to be measuring collective commitment, participation rates, long-term sustainability. But in this difficult financial climate, institutions needing to make cuts may gamble on free riding, maintaining access without participating. I mean, our budgets really changed this year. And when facing budget pressures, this can seem viable. But if too many institutions make that calculation, the model collapses. Meanwhile, equitable models like Diamond OA, for the authors anyway, or what my friend Amy calls the NPR model, those are the hardest to measure for local impact. This is where measurement alignment becomes even more critical. To build more sustainable and equitable models, we have to capture different types of value in ways that are compelling enough to justify local investment. So it's clear that the field needs to kind of collectively develop better ways to measure and communicate the impact of OA models, really across the spectrum, because the question isn't just what are we measuring, it's how are we measuring it in ways that enable the development of sustainable models at the local level that can build towards long-term transformation for all of us in the scholarly ecosystem. Oh, thank you. Did it work? This is my really fun, sad slide, you all. So the measurement challenge is especially urgent right now, you may be aware, because the landscape itself is shifting pretty dramatically. The US higher education system and the consortia that serve it, we're really dealing with the perfect storm. We've experienced massive federal research funding cuts impacting institutional budgets. State appropriations are declining. We're seeing enrollment challenges at some institutions, particularly those smaller schools. We're also facing rapidly evolving scholarly communication models and institutional and political pressures that are new to the US, attacks on academic and intellectual freedom, and scrutiny of higher education's value and purpose. That was the fun slide. Oh, thank you, Jason. Here's another fun slide. And the impacts are global. As of 2024, the US still invests more in research and development than any other country, almost $800 billion. The US produces over 36% of the world's highly cited research, and over 40% of our published research is done in collaboration with international partners. Shifts here have significant ripple effects globally on publisher sustainability, international collaborative projects, and open infrastructure investments. It changed, yay. A September 2026 survey that was conducted by Jill Morris of Palsy and myself of US consortia leaders asked, to what extent is your consortium being affected by recent events or changes in local or federal policy? Unsurprisingly, budget and funding allocations topped the list with the highest average impact score, but open access activities and publishing efforts, which are not unrelated to our budgets, were also right at the top, making it one of the highest expected impact areas reported. The survey made clear that open access publishing and open infrastructure are programs whose funding models are specifically at risk in this environment. I think that this really creates an urgency around how we measure and talk about the impact of these programs. It's not just an academic exercise, it's essential if we're going to successfully navigate this moment. And I think it also gives us an opportunity to evaluate what is important and rethink some of our approaches and the data we're collecting about them. The question we opened up with, the kind of what are the measurable outcomes of OA publishing agreements, I think matters more now than ever. And although it is clearly different depending on your mission and your organization, we really have to have standardized data that helps us to answer these questions for our local communities. If we don't yet have the data or the frameworks to answer the questions we're asking, we risk losing our opportunity to build sustainable and equitable open access models and infrastructures that actually work into the future. So thank you guys for listening to us. That's all we have.